picking up from our last discussion on Burckhardt's ironic lens, let's dive into how he actually conceptualized the Renaissance itself. He paints this picture of Italy during that period as a cultural explosion. But notice, he doesn't give us a neat, step-by-step explanation for why it happened. Instead, he kind of shrugs and says, well, the church and state were both worn out after centuries of fighting each other, so culture just had space to breathe. It's like saying a garden blooms because the weeds were pulled, necessary, but not the whole story. What really fascinates him is the mystery of the flourishing itself. Where does this stuff come from? He suggests it's deep down in the soul's vibrations. Think of it like a cosmic hum, and art captures that vibration, making something individual and fleeting into something symbolic, something that lasts forever. Culture, for Burckhardt, isn't just about politics or religion. It's this second creation, almost like an earthly immortality, a universal language that transcends time and place. It's the only thing, he implies, that truly endures. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Burckhardt looks at art, especially Renaissance art, and sees its physical form as temporary, subject to decay. But here's the kicker: you don't need the whole thing to get it. A single fragment, a sketch, an outline, even just a hint or allusion can carry the weight of the original inspiration. Think about seeing a shard of ancient pottery. You might not know the whole vase, but you can feel its history, its craftsmanship, its spirit. That's the power Burckhardt finds in the fragment. It's poignant precisely because it's incomplete, yet still resonates. And how do we bridge that gap between the fragment and the whole? Through analogy. We use what we see in the piece to reconstruct, or at least perceive, the larger work. It's like being a detective with only a few clues, but somehow grasping the essence of the crime. This focus on the fragment and analogy is crucial. It sets up his entire approach to understanding history, which often feels like piecing together a puzzle from scattered, sometimes contradictory, pieces. This brings us to the heart of Burckhardt's method: irony. It's not just a stylistic choice, it's the very lens through which he views history. Imagine him as a super sophisticated art collector, standing over a pile of archaeological fragments unearthed from a dig site. He doesn't have the full blueprint of the original building. What he does is look closely at the fragments, compare them, and through analogy, try to guess what the original context might have been. He can point towards the shape of the lost world, but he can't fully specify it. It's like Kant's things in themselves, necessary postulates for our understanding, but ultimately unknowable in their true nature. Burckhardt adopts this connoisseur's voice. He's the ironist, someone with a wiser, perhaps sadder, perspective than his audience. He sees the historical field not as a neat, orderly place, but as a messy stew, a satura, full of detached fragments whose original contexts are either lost or simply unknowable. Meaning isn't out there waiting to be discovered in a simple linear fashion. It has to be divined, inferred, and is always, to some extent, elusive. So, how does this ironic perspective translate into storytelling? It means Burckhardt's narrative style is inherently skeptical, and dare I say, pessimistic. Forget grand, sweeping tales leading to a happy ending or a universal truth. His stories are filled with witty observations, sharp anecdotes, and those delightful throwaway lines that make you stop and think, like blaming the revolutions of 1848 on sheer boredom, or Napoleon's defeat on his own impatience. It's brilliantly cynical. The plot structure itself reinforces this. There's no grand arc, no ultimate point towards which everything converges. No sudden epiphanies revealing the grand laws of history, no neat reconciliations, no transcendent moments. Things just happen ambiguously without resolution. Epistemologically, he's a skeptic. He refuses to play prophet and predict the endgame. Psychologically, he's a pessimist. He doesn't see any truly meaningful stopping points in the messy middle ground between an unknowable beginning and an unforeseeable end. He takes a kind of grim satisfaction in resisting the easy answers and prevailing trends of his own time. And he despises mere narration, storytelling without that deeper, often ironic insight. If there's one constant thread running through Burckhardt's thought, it's his identification of the enemies he constantly battles. And these enemies for him are illusions. They take two main forms, both rooted in a failure of realism. First, there's metaphorical reduction, which inevitably leads to allegory. This is the trap of taking complex historical events and boiling them down to simplistic moral fables. Good triumphs over evil, or some such. Second, there's excessive symbolization, which leads to metaphysics. This is the opposite extreme, losing touch with concrete reality and sublimating everything into vague, abstract, timeless spiritual forces. Interestingly, his form theory of history, with its focus on the interplay of culture, religion, and the state, was really just a reflection of his deeper theory of culture itself. And his theory of culture, it involved a threefold tension between allegorical, symbolical, and historical sensibilities. Now, here's the kicker. He probably never explicitly called this a theory. It wasn't something he formally laid out, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface, and he presented it quite clearly in his Cicerone, his guidebook to Italian art from 1855. This book, focused on art appreciation, becomes a window into his core historical philosophy. Let's talk about the Cicerone. This little guidebook, subtitled A Guide to the Enjoyment of the Artworks of Italy, is arguably where Burckhardt speaks most directly, and perhaps most authentically, as a historian. Why? Because art appreciation allowed him to bypass the complexities of interpreting language and documents. When facing a painting or sculpture, the medium and the message for Burckhardt should ideally be one and the same. You confront the object directly, and your job is to extract its formal coherence, its visual integrity. There's no need to first decipher what the artist was saying in words before appreciating the work itself. He believed art objects were self-referential. Their quality, mood, style might reflect the age they came from, but to truly enjoy them, you didn't necessarily need to delve into the socio-political context of their creation. In fact, some speculate that his decision to exclude visual arts from his massive civilization of the Renaissance was deliberate, perhaps to subtly discourage the idea that high art was somehow dependent on or determined by external circumstances like patronage or politics. For him, the artwork stood on its own formal merits. Now, despite being less historical in its explicit aims, the Cicerone is surprisingly structured chronologically. It follows Schopenhauer's aesthetic hierarchy, moving from architecture to sculpture to painting, each section tracing the development from classical antiquity through the Baroque period. The story told is one of a gradual ascent, reaching the pinnacle of excellence in the High Renaissance, followed by a decline or dissolution of that harmony and balance in all three fields. But notice the tone at the end. It's not tragic but elegiac melancholy. The section on architecture ends with descriptions of villas and gardens. Sculpture concludes with Canova's funeral monument. Painting closes with reflections on Poussin and Claude's landscapes of the Roman Campagna. These aren't triumphant finales, they're quiet, reflective moments. And it's within this discussion of painting, particularly, that we find the most revealing insights into the principles of historical sensibility and narration that Burckhardt himself applied to the broader study of history. The painting section is where his historiography gets its clearest articulation. So, how does Burckhardt analyze the artists? Let's look at his take on the early periods. The Paleo-Christian and Byzantine phases? Inferior, he argues, because they suffered from mechanical repetition. Dogma and authority stifled creativity, forcing artists into rigid patterns. Think of endless copies of the same saints and scenes lacking spark. Then comes the Romanesque, viewed primarily as mythical and symbolic. But here, Burckhardt spots a glimmer of health, the emergence of a simple narrative style. This directness is seen as a positive step. Moving into the Gothic period in Italy, distinct from the Northern Gothic, he sees the birth of naturalism. Painting breaks free from being merely decorative for architecture, though it still serves religious purposes, and starts developing its own unique potential for representation. And who's the linchpin here? Giotto. For Burckhardt, Giotto is foundational. Crucially, Giotto's achievement isn't primarily about achieving ideal beauty or perfect realism, though he excelled in these areas. Rather, it was his skill as a narrator. He gave people what they needed to make the story clear, simply, and beautifully. Think of the frescoes in Padua or Assisi. The figures exist solely to illuminate the narrative, to explain the action. They aren't primarily icons pointing to abstract concepts outside themselves. Giotto brought the story to life. Now, even in Giotto, Burckhardt notes the allegorical element isn't completely eliminated. And this, he sees, is where the danger lies. Allegory, with its reliance on metaphor, is inherently prone to distorting the subject. Metaphor for Burckhardt is poison to art and truth. He gives a scathing example, representing the obligation to poverty as a marriage with poverty. It's a metaphor, he insists, and art should never be built on such a foundation. It creates a necessarily false result. Once allegorical figures start acting, nothing can avoid metaphor, leading to absurdities. He suggests the ire triumph of the Renaissance can be characterized by its growing awareness of the dangers of metaphorical characterization. As a complement to allegory, artists used representations of abstract ideas, often borrowed from antiquity. But these, when used in connection with allegories, remained mere curiosities, revealing the naive historical understanding of the time. How did the Renaissance escape this trap? Again, through Giotto's development of that specifically narrative style. By focusing on clear storytelling, they pushed back against the corrupting influence of metaphor. Okay, but hold on. Burckhardt quickly distinguishes allegory from symbolism. Symbolism, he argues, is necessary. It's required for expressing sublime ideas, those big, profound concepts related to the world beyond the grave, prophecies, the kind of stuff that fills Dante's Divine Comedy. These ideas can't be captured in a purely historical composition, but they look to art for their highest rendering. However, artworks trying to render these sublime ideas need to be careful. They'll be more impressive, Burckhardt says, the less allegory they contain, and the more they focus on living distinct action. Think about Dante again. The symbolic meaning of the Divine Comedy is interesting as literature and history, but its poetic power comes entirely from Dante's masterful artistic presentation of single incidents, his measured grand style. So, Western art history, according to Burckhardt, unfolds within a constant tension between three modes: allegorical, historical, and symbolic representation. The Renaissance style emerged as the allegorical, metaphorical impulse, fueled by medieval theology, gradually dissolved, allowing art to operate in the creative tension between sublime ideas, handled symbolically, and historical narration. So, eliminating metaphor while still handling both historical narrations and symbolic sublime ideas, that's the essence of Renaissance realism for Burckhardt. This realism manifests in a focus on details of the human form, the flow of movement, and the discovery of perspective rules. Crucially, this wasn't just slavish copying of ancient models. It was the result of studying nature. But this interest in external reality wasn't limitless. It developed within a full consciousness of those sublime ideas, which allowed for tact to set boundaries on fancifulness. Renaissance art, he says, possessed the tact to follow external reality only so far as the higher poetic truth wouldn't suffer. Details could be rich in architecture or decoration, in beautiful draperies, but not bogged down in the prosaic accidents of everyday life. The result? An impression of splendor, not weariness. This is Burckhardt's ideal realism, standing in stark contrast to what he saw as the vulgar realism of the 19th century, which he criticized as mere photographic reproduction of details, lacking any guiding principle derived from sublime ideas. His own historiography aimed for this same tactful realism, balancing symbolism and narration, always wary of the pitfalls of metaphor and allegory. And then, the Renaissance suddenly springs forth in the Cinquecento, like a flash of lightning, like a gift from heaven. The time had simply come. The great masters gathered eternal truths for imperishable works. Each had their way, creating a multiform revelation of the highest. But, like all beautiful things, the full bloom was short. Burckhardt marks Raphael's lifetime as witnessing the rise of all that was most perfect, and the decline began immediately after him. He already saw signs of this decline in his two great contemporaries. Leonardo, he felt, leaned too heavily on landscape, creating a dreamy effect like in the Mona Lisa, which disturbed Burckhardt and reflected a reversion to allegory. Michelangelo, by contrast, went too far in the other direction towards symbolism. Everything became too sublime, lacking a counterbalance of concrete detail. There was no grounding in the things that make life dear to us. This lack of tact, exemplified by the Last Judgment, led to exaggeration, pushing towards mannerism. What Michelangelo lacked, according to Burckhardt, was history, the grounding in concrete, everyday detail. This absence gave his work its grandeur, but also marked the beginning of the decline, from Raphael's perfection. Raphael, by contrast, struck that perfect balance. His detail is so powerful you might think it's essential, but the charm of the whole is infinitely more distinctive. Even in early portraits, Raphael showed himself a great historical painter. In his Virgin pictures he used minimal symbolism, thoroughly mastering symbolic expression where appropriate, as seen in the Vatican frescoes. Even in tackling conventionalized subjects like Ezekiel's vision, he transformed them using the greatest beauty possible within the constraints of the coarse symbol. The Camera della Segnatura frescoes are the culmination. Here Raphael took allegorical and historical subjects dictated by tradition, separated them for individual treatment, and represented the historical scenes with his unique, balanced genius. The figures in the Disputa are treated purely pictorially, belonging to an idealized past. The School of Athens is utterly without mystery, a conscious symbol of harmony between mind and soul, a complete harmony of picturesque and dramatic motives. The miracle of Bolsena achieves formal coherence even amidst apparent movement and excitement. This is for Burckhardt the first extensive work of art entirely harmonious in form and idea. Raphael, then, is the first in whom the form is entirely beautiful, noble, and at the same time intellectually alive, without injury to the whole effect. No detail comes forward too prominently. The artist understands exactly the delicate life of his great symbolic subjects, knowing how easily special interest can overwhelm the whole. Yet his individual figures became invaluable studies for later painters. In later cycles like the Stanza dell'Eodoro, the Stanza dell'Incendio, and the Sala di Costantino, his powers as a historian and dramatist were consolidated. Especially in the Battle of Constantine, he captured an ideal historical moment with perfect vividness and ideality, turning all requirements into uses of his genius. For Burckhardt, Raphael's genius was moral, not just aesthetic. He remained true to both history and art simultaneously, creating works of beauty and eternal interest. The soul of the modern man has no higher master and guardian in the realm of beautiful form than he is. And characteristically, Burckhardt ends his praise on an elegiac note. This moral quality would have remained with him even to his old age, had he lived longer. If we think over the colossal power of creation of his very last years, we shall feel what has been lost forever by his early death. After this towering tribute to Raphael, Burckhardt's story of Italian art turns downwards. Titian and Tintoretto had their moments, their excellences, but the overall trajectory was one of sustained decline towards mediocrity and vulgarity. The dominant feature of the modern school, as he called it, was its tendency towards vulgar realism. This, he argued, failed in the highest aims because it aimed too much at direct representation and illusion, yet, coming from a late period of culture, couldn't achieve sublimity through simple ingenuousness. It tried to make everything real, ignoring the spectator's inner sense, looking for different kinds of emotions. He analyzed the faults without much sympathy. Narrative pictures included anything impressive, often descending into vulgarity. Historical painting succumbed to a gory fascination with martyrdoms, seeking naturalism above all else. Caravaggio's Medusa, for instance, aroused disgust rather than deep emotion due to its horror. Sacred subjects were rendered in the good style of contemporary society. Emotions were shown through expression alone, leading to clichés like swooning females. The sacred and profane blurred into a common supersensual naturalism. Genre painting, pioneered by Caravaggio, tended to be repulsively humorous or horribly dramatic. The only exception, landscape, where Poussin and Claude Lorraine could express genius fully, creating a heroic pastoral nature. Now, let's shift gears slightly to Burckhardt's view of the relationship between history and poetry. He famously said the rivalry between them was settled by Schopenhauer, arguing that poetry achieves more for the knowledge of human nature and that history is indebted to poetry for insight into mankind as a whole. What does this mean, practically? It means poetry provides the principles by which historical visions of specific events are related to each other, forming a construction adequate to their inner content or essential form. In fact, Burckhardt believed the most informative documents revealing a civilization's true inner nature were poetic ones. History finds in poetry not only one of its most important but also one of its purest and finest sources. But poetry itself faces threats, mirroring the threats to tactful realism. Originally appearing as the voice of religion, poetry soon became the vehicle for the poet's own personality. This splitting off from religion represented an aspiration to the sublime, reaching its peak in Attic drama, where Aeschylus and Sophocles aimed to make ideal figures speak with the voice of all mankind. By contrast, medieval poetry remained tied to liturgy, while modern poetry, in Burckhardt's view, was shot through with allegorical and satirical morality. Burckhardt was quite upfront about his own historiography. He admitted his historical pictures were mere reflections of ourselves, laying no claim to system. Yet, he clearly saw the insights yielded by historical narration as being of essentially the same nature as those of properly written poetry. Both history, like poetry, and like the visual poetry of Raphael, avoided the dangers of excessive allegorization and excessive symbolism. What this boils down to is an attack on all forms of metaphorical characterization of the objects in the historical field and the relationships between them. This anti-metaphorical stance is in essence the quintessence of Burckhardt's irony. This leads to the apparent purity of his style. It's full of simple declarative sentences, often using the simple copulative verb form almost exclusively. Paragraphs become virtuoso variations on the simple notion of being. The structure is paratactical, juxtaposing ideas rather than building complex arguments through subordination. There seems to be a conscious suppression of hypothetical construction or argument. He's matching his impressions, his sense of the sublime, against others, asserting them rather than arguing for them. It's a style resistant not only to metaphor but also to the temptations of metonymy and synecdoche, aiming for a direct, almost impressionistic presentation of historical phenomena. So, how do we apply these insights about Renaissance art back to historiography? The twin threats to historical writing for Burckhardt were the same as those facing Renaissance art: allegory and symbolization. On one hand, allegorical historiography, like Augustine's City of God, reduces historical events to mere manifestations of presumed moral forces or ideology. On the other hand, excessive symbolization, like Hegel's system, dissolves concrete events into a metaphysical framework, stripping away particularity. Genuine historiography, like Raphael's art, must subordinate these impulses to the needs of realistic representation. What does this realism entail? Two components. First, apprehending the historical field as a set of discrete, unique events, no two exactly alike. Second, comprehending it as a fabric of relationships. The historian should aim for a sense of structure, like Raphael positioning figures in the School of Athens or the Battle of Constantine. Achieving formal coherence, much like the Fire of the Borgo, which appears chaotic but is a masterpiece of underlying form. Different periods of history are detachable from one another, like Raphael's individual paintings, each with its own content and formal problem solved. The criteria are aesthetic. The historian doesn't invent characters, but invents the formal relationships between elements, relating event to context, not microcosm to macrocosm. And crucially, the causes of an event's being what it is are hardly considered at all. It's about the structure, the interplay, the phenomenon. So, where does this leave us? Burckhardt offers us a theory, but it's primarily a theory of the framework within which historical events develop. It doesn't give us a neat formula for how events relate to that framework. Why? Because, fundamentally, he believed it's impossible to distinguish finally between an event and the larger historical framework in which it occurs. His approach is contextualist. Explanation comes from discriminating the various strands making up an era and displaying the linkages among events that create a fabric of the historical field. Crucially, the relationship between an event and its context isn't seen as a simple part to whole synecdochic relationship, like a microcosm reflecting a macrocosm. That language he used was usually reserved for moments when culture achieved dominance over the compulsive powers of politics and religion. The actual relationship between culture and these forces, and indeed between events and their context, is conceived metonymically. It's a fractured condition, a state of schism and conflict, an irreconcilable struggle of forces originating in the depths of human nature and ultimately mysterious. We can only deal with the products of this conflict phenomenologically. We can write narratives, but these won't describe a path leading to redemption, reconciliation, or a revelatory epiphany. That's the enduring legacy of Burckhardt's ironic, contextualist historiography.